There you go. Thank you. So I'm now going to introduce Dr. Mitchell, and then I will have to rush to my classroom because I'm actually supposed to be physically in the classroom, and I have some students are supposed to be there, but I couldn't do that before. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Mitchell. I'm going to rush to my classroom with my laptop so I don't miss a word. And so I'll see you in a different scenario. Okay, so really happy to have Paul with us today. First met him, I think, a year and a half ago at a conference on the Parliament, and I was impressed with his encyclopedic knowledge of all of the adaptation of the Frankenstein myth onto screen. I'm very much interested in Frankenstein in its original form, and then all of the different adaptations. I do that is part of our curriculum in the literature and cinema course I teach. But then I have to say that really I'm humbled by Dr. knowledge of the subject. So I'm going to give you a bit of information about his background here. Paul Mitchell teaches in the English department of the Universidad Católica de Valencia, and he publishes on Spanish and English cinema and television, particularly in relation to the Gothic and his latest research focuses on how contemporary cinematography and Frankenstein explore post-human identities, just as I've anticipated. So without further ado, thank you very much, Paul, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can hear me and that you can hear the slide on the screen. You can see the slide on the screen. And I hope you're enjoying this series of lectures about mythology in the arts. First of all, I'll just say a quick thanks to Amaya Fernandez for inviting me to talk to you today. And I'm going to talk about Frankenstein on screen in the 21st century. It's a bit of a shame, I think, that I can't see you face to face. I'd really been looking forward to visiting Victoria. I've never been before. But with the COVID virus as it is, I think it's probably best that we're all safe behind our computer screens. And maybe it's actually quite appropriate, because one of the things that I'm going to talk about today is how technology can impact upon our experience of being human in the 21st century. Okay, so I'm going to try to move on the screen. Hopefully you can see the change in the slides. Okay, now my talk today is going to have three parts. I'll begin by just giving a brief kind of historical overview of Frankenstein as a text and as a myth. And then I'll talk about a couple of significant adaptations of Frankenstein in the past before I focus on the main idea of my talk today, which is to look at Frankenstein in film and television in the 21st century. Okay, now first of all, let me talk about the title. Okay, Mary Shelley's posthumous post-human monsters. Okay, so I'm going to talk about characters that exist posthumously long after the publication of Shelley's text in 1818, but they're also characters that are post-humans, characters who through their transgression of normal human characteristics draw into question or problematize our understanding of what is a human being. But perhaps also my title is slightly disingenuous. It says Mary Shelley's posthumous monsters, but in reality, I don't think the Frankenstein myth can be necessarily linked exclusively to Mary Shelley. Instead, the myth has become a cultural phenomenon. It's been retold so many times and with so many variations that it now actually transcends Mary Shelley's authorship. And so you can see that I've written Frankenstein myth on the screen without italics in order to indicate that I'm not going to be talking exclusively about Shelley's novel. And in fact, it's this problematic link really between the Frankenstein myth and the novel that I'm going to focus on in some part today. I'm sure you already know that Shelley rewrote her own text in 1831 when she published an updated version that introduced a much more religious element to her story. And so that leads me to make 4 initial introductory observations about the Frankenstein myth. First of all, I'd like to suggest that the concept of Frankenstein as a myth is very organic. And that means that it's a myth that is always changing and always growing. And it's this changeability that actually allows the myth to remain relevant in the modern world, and particularly in the 21st century. And in fact, one of the things that I hope to do today is to explain to you why I think Frankenstein is actually more relevant now as a myth than it was when it was actually written in 1818 or published in 1818. Now on the screen you can see 2 examples of how the myth has evolved in the years since it was published. On the left you can see the first theatre version of Frankenstein, which was actually called Presumption, The Fate of Frankenstein. And this introduced a very interesting idea. In this play, the creature can't speak, which is very different, obviously, from Shelley's novel, where the character speaks for almost a third of the text. And then on the right of the screen, we can see the first cinema treatment of Frankenstein. This is a film made in 1910 by the Edison Studios. And what this film did is introduce a very important symbol into the Frankenstein myth. On the right of the screen, you can just about see a mirror. And this, it seems to me, is a very influential addition to the Frankenstein myth, not something that's necessarily in Shelley's novel. But through this, we get the idea that Victor and the creature in some way reflect each other. But nowadays, of course, there are hundreds, literally hundreds, of other films, novels, graphic novels, comics, children's cartoons, the list goes on. Many, many different retellings and reinterpretations of the Frankenstein story. And so that leads me to a second observation. In terms of the myth, there is no such thing as Frankenstein. There are only Frankensteins. Okay? When we talk about the Frankenstein myth, we're actually talking about a very plural concept. Okay? The notion that there is one single coherent narrative just doesn't stand up. Okay? Frankenstein, because of its fluidity, because of its evolution, is always changing. And in fact, when you think about the novel itself and then its translation onto the screen and into theatre, at the heart of all these stories, at the heart of the Frankenstein myth, is a story about change, the capacity of the human being to change and to be changed. And that concept is very much kind of embodied by the physical body of Victor's creature. It's a story about mutation that in itself has mutated throughout the centuries since its first publication. So a third key idea that I'd like to propose is this, that Frankenstein is fundamentally a myth about the evolution of the human as a body and as a being. It's a story that embodies the tension between stasis, staying the same, and changing, evolving through the inclusion of new ideas or new interpretations. And in fact, when we think about the basic elements of the Frankenstein story, we begin to see how Shelley's novel also evolves from previous myths about human existence. Shelley, of course, as you probably know, gave her story a subtitle, The Modern Prometheus. And this indicates that she was inspired to some extent by the Titan culture hero who crafted mankind out of clay and who stole fire from the gods. It's a figure that represents the triumph of rationality over superstition, or perhaps it could be seen as a very arrogant character, one who wants to take control over the natural world. So Shelley's story about Victor Frankenstein is an updated myth which is based on Prometheus, a Prometheus, if you like, for the 19th century. a world in which science was beginning to become very important. And Victor is, of course, a scientist, not a god, who creates a new form of the human being. And very importantly, this being is given life by a man, not through the body of a woman. So this notion of male birth perhaps also suggests that Shelley is reinventing the myth of Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, who was born from the thigh of his father Zeus. However, I think Shelley sees this whole concept of male birth very negatively, because Victor's experiment, which effectively eliminates women from the birth process, leads to the death of all those that he holds most dear. However, given that the agent of this destruction is actually Victor's creature, I'd like to propose a third, perhaps less obvious, reference in Shelley's story to Greek mythology. Pandora was the first human woman, and like Dionysus, she was also created by a male god, this time Zeus's son, Hephaestus. But Pandora was born for a very specific purpose. She was created to punish mankind for using the fire that Prometheus had stolen. And as we know, she was given a jar, which you can see in the painting on the screen. Although this word, pithos, the Greek word pithos, is often translated as box. So when Pandora opened the jar or the box, evil and destruction were released into the human world. Now, if we think about this myth of Pandora in relation to Frankenstein, perhaps we think of the creature, the first post-human, as a Pandora figure, a character who takes revenge against Victor for his crimes against the Christian god of Shelley's 19th century era. And so while the humans in the Pandora myth are punished for their use of fire, the fire that Prometheus stole, Victor is punished for using electricity, an energy source that became important, of course, in the increasingly industrial and scientific world of the early 19th century. So I think it's clear that Shelley's novel changes elements from Greek mythology in order to engage with her contemporary world. And Brian Aldiss has described Frankenstein as the first great myth of the industrial age, precisely because it addresses 19th century fears, or early 19th century fears, about how science could change the notion of the human being. But what I want to argue today is that we continue to have the same anxieties in the 21st century, even if those fears have been updated for the more technological age in which we live. So today I'm going to talk about Frankenstein on screen, because I'd like to argue that through film and television, two popular technological medium, we can explore profound questions about human identity. Screen adaptations of Frankenstein always explore the connection between ourselves and technology. And so in doing so, they help us to visualize what the not too distant future might actually look like. But most screen versions of Frankenstein, whether on film or television, often receive very negative critical judgments from viewers and from professional critics, because more often than not, they're felt to be too different from Shelley's novel. Now, this idea I find very strange. For me, it shows a misunderstanding about the concept of adaptation. After all, to adapt doesn't mean to copy. It means to change or to reinvent. Now, I'm certainly not saying that all screen versions of Frankenstein are very good. In fact, there are lots that are really, really bad, okay? But bad doesn't necessarily mean that they are worthless of our academic attention. In fact, what I would like to suggest is that no one version of Frankenstein should be seen as more valid or authentic than any other, and that includes Shelley's original novel. So what I would like to say is therefore that we recognize all screen versions of Frankenstein on film and television as valid, even if we don't like the stories that they tell. Now, before getting into the 21st century, I'd like to give a quick example of a film adaptation that has added important elements to the Frankenstein myth. And I'm sure we all recognize this face from the 1931 James Whale film, Frankenstein, that was made for Universal Studios. Played by actor Boris Karloff, the creature's image has become so iconic that Universal Studios now have it protected under copyright. But it's actually very unlike the creature's physical appearance in Shelley's text, where she speaks of the yellow skin that scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing. Karloff's makeup was bluey green, and his hair clearly isn't flowing. And Shelley makes no mention of a neck bald, which we can see in the photograph. So Shelley's version of the creature more authentic than James Whale's? I don't think so. In fact, Karloff's creature has added a whole new visual dimension to the Frankenstein myth. What's more, the scientist character in Whale's film is called Henry, not Victor. And he's also got an assistant who's called Fritz, who helps him with his experiments. Whereas, of course, in Shelley's novel, Victor works alone. And it's Fritz who steals a criminal's brain so that it can be transplanted into the creature's head, even though there's no such plotline in Mary Shelley's original story. So what we can see here is that Shelley's novel establishes a blueprint of the myth, if you like, but Whale's film then adds important new elements that make it much more relevant to American society in the 1930s, the era in which the film was released. For example, in Shelley's novel, the creature's violence is a response to its social exclusion. So we can say that it's the result of nurture. But in Whale's film, the creature is violent because it has a criminal's brain. So in Whale's film, the creature's behavior is the result of nurture. It's down to its genetics. And this notion reflected a popular debate in 1930s America about the existence of a so-called criminal gene. People at the time wanted to know, or wanted to use science to know, if criminals were born that way, or if they were made criminals by society. So Whale's film reinvents Shelley's ideas for the early 20th century, a period in which the study of genetics was becoming an increasingly important branch of scientific research. Okay, so let's move on now and talk about the 21st century. And particularly, let's talk about these posthumous monsters who are also post-humans, characters who are not human, but also not totally non-human either. Here's one. It's called the UX. And he's a post-human being that's been made by genetic modification. Now, visually, he has a lot in common with the typical monsters from other Frankenstein films. Here you can see some examples of them on screen from Christopher Lee in the first Frankenstein film that was made by Hammer Studios. That's the top left. To the most recent, the 2015 film, Victor Frankenstein, which has the character at the bottom of the screen. Okay. Now, this one was a total box office flop. Some of you may have seen it, but I actually quite like it. Okay. The important thing, though, here I think is that we're not actually scared of these monsters anymore. When we look at them, they look pretty silly. They're certainly not scary. We're probably more likely to laugh out loud. So in the modern world, the horror of Frankenstein has been reinvented. It's no longer a story about our fear of terrible post-human monsters that have been created by mad scientists. Instead, with our ever-increasing knowledge of genetic engineering and artificial intelligence, the horror of Frankenstein is now much more or much closer to reality. It's much more realizable. The Frankenstein story, of course, has always been about ourselves, but now more than ever. I think it's become a myth about our anxieties of living on this very thin divide between technophilia, our love of technology, and technophobia, our fear of what it will do. So Frankenstein is still important, therefore, because it expresses our fears about how the science fiction of the past is increasingly becoming science fact. The myth allows us to interrogate the impact that near-futuristic technologies could have on our lives. Now, in the 1990s, in 1993, John Turney described Frankenstein as one of the most important myths of modernity, the governing myth of biology. It's been a very influential judgment about the Frankenstein myth, and it's one with which I agree. But I'd like to also update Turner's idea for the new millennium. And so I'd like to suggest that Frankenstein has become, in the 21st century, our most important myth about synthetic biology, the scientific process through which we can genetically engineer new life forms. And this notion is played out in the first film that I want to discuss. Jed Mercurio's British adaptation of Frankenstein was broadcast on the public access television channel ITV in 2007. Taking place in an unspecified near-future universe, the story focuses on Victoria Frankenstein, a female stem cell biologist. Now, I'm not going to comment too much today about this change to Frankenstein's gender from Victor to Victoria, but suffice to say that it indicates one way in which the film problematizes the boundaries of gender, of identity, and of species. Victoria is the lead scientist on the Universal Xenograph Project, an experiment into the biotechnology of DNA ligation. Now, this is the scientific process by which body organs can be genetically engineered for human transplants. The creature, here named the UX, as I've mentioned, is an accidental byproduct of this research. However, because we have the word xenograph used, this is a word that means body organs from non-human species. And so, by using this word, the film establishes a destabilization of the human and the post-human from the beginning. Post-human identity in the film is represented as this radical fusion of different species. And this notion is shown when Victoria deliberately mixes the DNA from her son with experimental stem cells. It's this fusion that then leads to the creation of the UX. Now, writer and director Jed Mercurio was actually a hospital doctor prior to his career in television. And he's expressed this idea that stem cell biology gone wrong provides such a credible and frightening basis for the creation of the monster. The story of Frankenstein is far closer to reality now than it ever was when it was first written. Now, the usual focus of the Frankenstein story is a warning about mad and usually male scientists. But in Mercurio's film, Frankenstein develops a new focus. This time, it explores the link between modern bioscientific research and capitalism. And this notion is explored particularly through the character of Professor Jane Pretorius, a character who's also a gender hybrid because it's based upon the male scientist in the 1935 film Bride of Frankenstein. Jane's interest in the commercial value of the UX reveals the importance of financial profit in modern bioscience. She plans to mass produce the UX, and this emphasizes not only her lack of humane feeling, but also the dispassionate economics that drives modern technological research. As Mercurio has suggested, advances in medical science saves lives and eases suffering, but I wouldn't want to see ill-conceived experiments with distressing consequences. Now, as in Wales' film from 1931, the UX is incapable of speech, and so it's unable to express its suffering at the hands of the scientific community. At one point, in fact, a metal bolt is surgically inserted into the UX's neck. Now, this scene is obviously very reminiscent of Wales' 1931 film, but in the modern high-tech world of the 21st century, this neck bolt allows scientists to physically paralyze the UX upon demand. It's a truly sinister use of technology. But importantly, Mercurio's film focalizes much of the narrative through Victoria's point of view, so that her shock at seeing the UX's treatment is also shared by us as spectators. When she sees that the UX has been chained to a metal frame, which we can see here on the screen, she says, "It's monstrous. It's like keeping a retarded child chained to a bed." So Mercurio's film creates an interesting new version of Frankenstein by exploring the ethics, not of science per se, but of the capitalists who fund biotechnological research. Indeed, Mercurio's adaptation suggests that the UX, though visually unconventional, is actually less horrific to the modern spectator than Jane Pretorius, who objectifies the UX and exploits it for her own financial profit. Instead, Mercurio's film suggests that it's Jane, the true monster of the 21st century, not the UX. Okay, so the second film that I'm going to discuss also focuses on high technology and capitalism. But Bernard Rose's 2015 film, Frankenstein, also puts emphasis on the important social dimension of synthetic biology. And Rose has stated that he wants the currency of Shelley's idea. She intuited at the very beginning of the scientific era that the purpose of science would be to create consciousness. Now here on the screen, we can see a still with Victor Frankenstein, who's on the right, and his creature, who's called Adam. It's a name, of course, that's mentioned in Shelley's novel, and it also obviously references the biblical story of Adam and Eve. And this scene takes place shortly after Adam's birth. But what is perhaps most visually striking about this is his appearance. Adam is much more handsome than the monsters that usually feature in Frankenstein screen adaptations. In fact, Adam is a very 21st century creation. He's not a zombie who's been stitched together from the body parts of the dead, like in Shelley's novel or in Wales' film. Instead, he's a synthetic post-human that's been created by a three-dimensional bioprinter, a high-tech machine that creates artificial beings that look and behave like humans. But Adam's body tissue rapidly begins to degenerate owing to a malfunction within his cellular design. It's an eventuality that leads Victor to try to kill his increasingly disfigured creation. But this decay of Adam's facial tissue actually acts as a very powerful metaphor for the dystopian nature of 21st century Los Angeles, the city in which the story takes place. A society of superficial beauty that disguises its corruption, its brutality, and its hypocrisy. So Rosie's film asked the audience to consider three very significant questions. Firstly, is Adam's status as a human only skin deep? And when he becomes ill, why is he banished from normal or normative human society? But perhaps more importantly, it asks us, what does this say about our attitude to the sick, the aged, and the disabled. Rose depicts Adam as an unfortunate social pariah, a persecuted member of the modern American underclass whose suffering is linked to their poverty. But importantly, the narrative is also oriented to Adam's perspective, on occasion even employing point of view shots to directly depict what he sees. And this technique effectively engineers our compassion for what we see him suffer. So when Adam behaves violently, as he does on occasion, this violence is mediated by our understanding that he's naive, he's frustrated, and also that he's very badly treated by the citizens of Los Angeles, people who are human but far from humane. Now, Adam's destitution, his scavenging for food, and the ragged clothes that he wears are all elements of the story that we also find in Shelley's novel. But in Rose's film, they act intertextually to represent the suffering of the homeless on the streets of modern-day Los Angeles. Here we can see two screenshots of Adam taking his place on the streets of Los Angeles. And in the novel, Shelley reflects upon human society, and her words are directly quoted by Adam in the film. He says, "I heard of the division of property, of immense wealth, and of squalid poverty. I learned that the possessions most esteemed by your fellow creatures were high and unsullied descent, united with riches." Spoken during a scene in which Adam observes two prostitutes stepping into the expensive car of a wealthy man, you can see the screenshot at the bottom. The film contrasts the physical and existential suffering of the poor with the immorality of the socially and financially privileged, which includes Victor, whose attitude to Adam changes when his physical illness appears. Now, Rose's film is very much about the 21st century. But the inclusion of this direct quotation from Shelley's novel also suggests our lack of progress since the early 19th century. We may have advanced our technical capabilities, for sure. In fact, what Elaine Graham says is techno-chanted, convinced that our command of technology can make us almost godlike. But we haven't yet fully used our high technology to remove inequalities from our society. In fact, perhaps, maybe technology has made the gap between the rich and the poor even bigger. So Rose's Frankenstein depicts a society in which wealth and technological progress mean that we are in danger of losing those values that we often think of as being exclusively human, our empathy, our compassion, our ability to love. And in this sense, Rose's modern Frankenstein repeats the same anxieties that Mary Shelley expressed in 1818. So although science may have changed our lives, and it will continue to do so, the capitalist system under which we've been living hasn't made us into more compassionate human beings. Now on the screen, we can see a still in which Adam is looking at his replacement, Adam Mark II, the next generation synthetic that Victor has created. To Victor's scientific technological eyes, Adam is just a malfunctioning prototype. And in contrast to the viewer, Victor doesn't see that Adam is an individual who has the right to live despite his deformity. So unlike the typical post-humans who are empowered by technology, Adam is unable to transcend the limitations of his degenerate body. As a synthetic post-human, therefore, he not only problematizes our belief in the absolute value of technology, but also our belief in the human being as a compassionate and exceptional species. Now, the third and final adaptation of the Frankenstein myth that I want to discuss is actually a television series. And its connection to Shelley's novel is very, very implicit. In fact, the Frankenstein name is never actually mentioned, and neither are there particularly visual references to previous versions of the Frankenstein story, except for the fact that it's a story about David Elster, a scientist who has created sentient artificial life. He's created robots that are fully conscious beings. And for this reason, I'd like to argue that humans represent a very interesting example of how the Frankenstein myth has been reinterpreted in the 21st century. The series was broadcast on the British television network Channel 4, and it ran for 3 seasons between 2015 and 2018. But in actual fact, it's based upon an earlier Swedish series, Äkta Människor, or Real Humans, which ran for just 2 seasons. Now, it's very difficult to come by a copy of the Swedish version, Real Humans, particularly with subtitles. But if you can, I highly recommend it. It's a really interesting piece of work, and in some ways, I think it's actually better than the British version. Okay, but today I'm going to talk more about the British version because it has more links to the thread of my talk. Okay, now here on screen we can see David's creature. It's a gynoid, or a female robot, that is called a synth in the series. And using a female creature is interesting when we think about the Frankenstein myth in relation to Pandora, who I mentioned at the beginning. Here we can see the moment that she's purchased by her new owner and she's unwrapped from her packaging. So symbolically we can see that she's actually what's in Pandora's box. And this idea is actually even more explicit in the Swedish version, Real Humans, when the same character is literally delivered in an actual box. In Humans, the character is called Mina, although her new owner renames her Anita. This indicates to us from the beginning how identity is going to be a very problematic concept throughout the series. Now, through its echo of the Pandora myth, Humans uses the character of Mina to explore the hypothesis that's known as the singularity. It's the idea that at some point in the future, when robots become fully conscious through their artificial intelligence, they will destroy the human species. But in fact, Mina is just one of a family of conscious synths that David has created. And when David commits suicide, the synths decide that they are going to make other robots conscious by altering their source code. Now, this idea, this liberation of robots that have been enslaved by humans, is obviously a very common sci-fi trope. It occurs, for example, in the cult film Blade Runner, or in the excellent recent television series Westworld. In fact, the original meaning of the word robot is forced labor. And so Humans reinvents this, the Frankenstein myth in the 21st century as a post-colonial narrative about Britain's involvement in slavery and imperialism. And for this reason, it's significant that many of the synths are of African or Asian descent, a visual reference, if you like, to Britain's colonial past. But the trope of the synths as unwelcome foreign immigrants into modern British society is shown through a group called We Are People, a far-right political organisation that campaigns against the integration of robots into our everyday lives. They complain about the use of artificially intelligent machines in the workplace, which creates greater human unemployment, and also about the possibility that robots will change our way of life. Now, it's interesting that in this way, the We Are People group expressed the same racist attitudes that fueled much of the debate in the United Kingdom about Brexit. And it's significant, of course, that the second series of Humans was broadcast in 2016, the year in which Britain voted to leave the European Union. as one of the We Are People members says whilst attending a political meeting, in every area of human life, they are coming between us, and we can't even trust them not to hurt us. Now, here, obviously, the speaker is talking about synths, but it's exactly the same idea that right-wing politicians used in the UK to justify Brexit. However, humans fundamentally is interested in exposing the fallacy of the singularity, of our misplaced fear that of artificial intelligence. And what it basically tries to suggest is that just because human beings have historically tried to kill or to dominate rival groups and species, it's not inevitable that sentient robots would do the same. Now, of course, the same paranoid assumption is made by Victor in Shelley's novel when he worries about creating a race of devils that will take over the world. But in fact, the TV series suggests that it's highly possible these intellectually superior beings would not behave with the same destructive impulses as human beings. Instead, all they really seek is to be accepted by humans and for their differences from humans to be tolerated. Humans, though, interestingly updates the Frankenstein myth in the 21st century by suggesting that sentient robots or foreign immigrants are actually less dangerous to modern society than the small-minded prejudices of some human beings. In fact, from season 2 onwards, the focus of humans turns to an interesting question. If since they're fully conscious, if they can think and feel like we do, should they also have the same legal rights as human beings? Now, this question about post-human existence has been posed by the Frankenstein myth for many years. For example, in Shelley's novel, when the creature pleads to Victor to accept him, or in Rose's Frankenstein, when we feel sympathy for Adam because he's attacked viciously by the police. But in the 21st century, I think that with our increasing ability to create artificially intelligent machines, this question is now more urgent than it's ever been. For example, in season 1, Mina has a male owner who's initially unaware that she's sentient, that she's conscious. And he triggers an adult setting in her program so that she'll have sex with him. Now, watching this happen is very uncomfortable, and we are forced to ask ourselves some very complicated questions. We know that Mina is aware of what is happening, but her male owner thinks she's just a machine. So by pretending to be non-sentient, is Mina culpable for what happens to her? Or is this sexual abuse by a white male who takes advantage of his socially less powerful Asian servant? Is it sexual assault or rape? But perhaps most fundamentally, humans asks us to consider to what extent Mina and her fellow robots can be considered to have personhood, the legal state of being a person. These are very difficult questions to answer. Nevertheless, by asking them, humans demonstrates how the Frankenstein myth continues to explore how our interaction with technology can radically alter what we understand by the concept of the human being. And on this point, there's one final aspect of the TV series that I'd like to mention. In season 1, 2 human characters, Renee and Sophie, develop the symptoms of juvenile over-identification disorder. As a result, they both adopt the behaviors of the synths that they see around them. They begin to dress, to talk, and to move as if they were robots. And it becomes clear that they prefer to live as synths rather than as humans because robots are more reliable, more honest, caring, and calm than the people that they live with. So this new version of Frankenstein in which Frankenstein's creatures have become an active part of society, makes us consider the impact that such post-human beings could have on our society. It thinks about the psychological impact that intelligent synths could have on our children, for example. So to return to the symbol of the uncanny mirror, these intelligent machines show us perhaps our very human flaws as individuals, citizens, parents, and workers. But perhaps they also encourage us to learn from their example and to live more humane lives in the 21st century. If Victor had only listened to his creature, perhaps he could have done the same. Now, according to Claude Levi-Strauss, a myth is a lie that tells the truth. So what, we may ask, is the truth that Frankenstein tells? In my opinion, throughout the 200 years since it was first published, the Frankenstein myth has expressed our profound ambivalence about biological science and technology. On the one hand, we have a desire to create and control life and to improve the fragile bodies and minds that we've been given by evolution. And yet, with each new biotechnological advance, we become more fearful and uncertain about the potential of science to redesign and redefine the human being. Now, this ambivalence makes Frankenstein even more important, I think, in the 21st century, in our technological age. Now, I'm not a scientist, so I don't know when or if we'll ever be able to make beings like the UX or Adam or Mina. But fundamentally, I don't think that's the point. The screen versions of Frankenstein that I've discussed today are not so interested in how we can engineer these synthetic post-humans. Instead, they're much more interested in exploring the impact that such science could have on our understanding of ourselves. They engage, therefore, with issues such as capitalism, right-wing prejudices, and legal questions about personhood to explore how post-humans can make us rethink existence and our priorities in the 21st century. Now, science and technology have, of course, changed a great deal since Shelley's day. But despite this, and I think above all else, Frankenstein remains a myth about the need for us to be a more compassionate species. Okay, well, that's the end. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. And I know we're kind of running a little bit short of time, but if anyone has any quick comments or questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me and see me? Well, barely. Hey Paul, can you hear me?
Sorry, yes, I turned off my microphone. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Right, so I don't know, where should I stand? I'm confused, sorry. So Daniel, do you have a question? Because if you have, you can either type it or you can use a microphone. Oh, okay. So no questions. I think my students will probably recognize already many of the topics that we have started to introduce. The difference, the dichotomic position of post-human versus human, objectification of the other, and of course this idea of adaptations not being just copies, but being a work of art, piece of art in of itself that is in dialogue with other versions of the same, in this case, myth. So this is your chance to ask questions to an expert on Frankenstein. If you don't have any questions, of course I'll ask one, but because I have actually plenty. But I'd really like to hear from you, so please don't be shy. I have people actually here in the room with me.
All right.
No? Absolutely nothing, no comments. Have you actually seen any of these films, TV series? Have you actually seen any film based on this myth? Are you interested in this myth? Anything? or people are very shy and or possibly very tired at this point. So I think I'm going to ask you, Paul, a question. So you've mentioned, well, of course, we've seen that in most, if not all of these texts that you presented, that you addressed today, the humans are pitted against non-humans and vice versa. And there's even if the TV series Humans, I haven't seen it, my bad. But I seem to have understood that there is a lot of controversy, and that they are, even though there are some humans who identify with these things, there is not a homogeneous feeling of peace and what's the word? Just tolerance towards the other.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, because you also mentioned Westworld. At the end of the first season in Westworld, even though it's not clear at all what's going to happen in the fourth season, but there is this possible suggestion that there might be a third way, a third space for humans and non-humans to actually merge into the post-human and become this other thing, that it's neither of the original two opposite polarized ends of the dichotomy.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, because this is just a suggestion, have you any, can you think of any version of the Frankenstein myth or of these post-human identities, films based on this topic, that shows an understanding and a merging of these two opposite ends of the dichotomy of humans and non-humans? The post-human as a space of tolerance and peaceful coexistence, and even perhaps identification.
Yeah, I mean, do you mean in terms of like physical hybridization, in terms of kind of cyborg?
No. More in terms of political, social-cultural understanding of the other and embracing these others in the plural.
In terms of the Frankenstein films that exist up to now are interesting in the sense in which they always resist that idea, whilst also gesturing towards it, in the sense that they never quite go down the route of showing a very kind of positive resolution for the creature, but the majority of them show a great deal of sympathy for that figure. And so I think there is a very common element now in Frankenstein cinema and television, which is that the creature is no longer this kind of vilified other, that it's become very much identified with the notion of the immigrant and the migrant, and therefore it's very much about the way in which that character holds a mirror up to ourselves and to our failings in terms of our lack of compassion, our lack of empathy, our lack of welcome to other nationalities and ethnicities. So I think what most of these films do is to suggest that the logical next step for us as a human species is to become much more tolerant of otherness. But I think in terms of the Frankenstein films directly, specifically the direct adaptations of Shelley's story, they always resist making that point completely positively, if you like. Whereas I think the TV series Humans and also Real Humans, because of the nature of them being series and therefore having a longer narrative arc, they can fundamentally develop the characters over a longer period of time. What we find in those is actually a much more positive sense of resolution in terms of peaceful coexistence. That the outcome of most of these series is that actually we need to see these figures, these post-human figures, as non-threatening and actually can contribute positive things to our society. I would say in television series they offer a more positive view.
Yes, yeah, that's kind of the sense I was getting as well.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Paul. I don't think we have much more time left. And also, Belen, I'm not in charge of the whole thing anymore. So
Okay,
could you
I'll
please get
shut it
Simon?
down. Okay.
So no more questions. Nobody else wants to ask anything. But well, for my students, this is going to be basically the core of our unit about Frankenstein. So thank you very much for a very, very clear exposition, and you basically covered everything that I meant to cover. So
Thank you very
much again. And I really hope I'll be able to see you here in the flesh next year and show you this beautiful town of ours, show you around. So, well, see you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
I look forward to it. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.